Okay, guys, so I wanted to come back to intellectual empathy briefly, and then I'll go over the extra credit for Unit 3. So, one other point I wanted to make has to do with the one of the opposites of intellectual empathy, and that has to do with the extreme of excess, also a vice. And we might call that intellectual obsequiousness. So, look in your online dictionary to see the meaning of obsequious and how you spell it. If you're using closed captioning, you might see the word obsequious. But obsequious can be thought of as being overly attentive, excessively attentive to someone else, to the other, almost like excessive deference, bowing down to them too much, like almost like erasing yourself or dismissing your own self-worth or what you have to offer or who you are or your status in relation to someone else or others. And so what I want you to think about is that maybe intellectual obsequiousness is when you have too much of that, which makes you otherwise intellectually empathetic when it comes to the viewpoints of others. So maybe someone who is intellectually obsequious is like aggressively and always trying to understand how others use some beliefs to justify others, always trying to discern and identify the concepts of others at the cost of, right, or at the sake of sharing their own point of view. So you have to listen to that entire statement I just made so that you don't distort what I said. So of course, as an intellectually empathetic person, you want to be mindful of the need to and the ability to and actually get yourself to imaginatively put yourself in the thinking place of others to understand their conceptual frameworks or reasoning. But you don't want to do it to the extent or in a way such that you dismiss your own point of view, you dismiss your own ideas, you do it on the assumption or on the presupposition or on the judgment that sharing your own views and other people understanding what you have to say, other people understanding your logic, your concepts doesn't matter. So just as you want to be able to express intellectual empathy towards others, you want to be in a position and be able to share your views such that others can try to understand your views, get into your thinking shoes, such that, they get a chance to practice intellectual empathy. So that's the little bit that I wanted to add, going too much, having too much of that, which makes you otherwise intellectually empathetic. You just dismiss your own views. You say, my own views don't matter. The only views that matter, the only views that I should try to understand, the only views that anybody should try to understand are other views, but not my own, which is interesting because if we all did that, then we'd be left with no one trying to understand anyone's views. Okay, so let's get to the extra credit for Unit 3, the Unit 3 test. So in a previous video, I had a different focus for assessing yourself in terms of intellectual empathy. I didn't go over that. I was too focused on just talking about intellectual empathy and I wanted to get to intellectual perseverance. But now I'm ready to talk about the extra credit and I want to call your attention to the fact that I have changed the focus a bit. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you think you have reflected or manifested intellectual empathy in virtue of trying to understand how philosophers think about causality, free will, and moral responsibility? Okay, so obviously I'm talking about the chapter, the section in the, okay, so you're reading from chapter 2 for Unit 3. And then there was a section in which Lawhead introduces you to the problem of free will. So this is before the section on, so it's the overview of that problem. So it's before his dedicated section for hard determinism, before his dedicated section for metaphysical libertarianism, before his dedicated section for soft determinism, aka what he calls compatibilism. In presenting the material that he does prior to the subsections focused on a particular theory, what he's doing is he's trying to help you trying to help you understand the thinking place of metaphysicians, of philosophers who focus on reality, to understand why they think there are problems when it comes to causality, our concepts of causality, the reality of causality, its implications for free will, and then, of course, the consequences or implications, social, moral, and cultural, when it comes to our notions of moral responsibility. So, as I mentioned in the lecture on intellectual empathy, when you're trying to understand, even in taking a class, it's necessary to express intellectual empathy, to understand how a discipline makes sense of self, world, and other. Then within a class, you're doing reading. So in philosophy, when you're reading chapter 3, you were trying to understand or get in the thinking place of epistemologist. And why do they think that there are issues, problems, concerns? In chapter 2, you're trying to get in the thinking place of a metaphysician, to see what they think about reality. What are the problems, concerns, issues, and questions that we should be focused on? So notice how you expressed intellectual empathy when it came to chapter 3 by trying to get in the thinking place of epistemologists, and now you're trying to express intellectual empathy, or we're trying to express intellectual empathy in getting in the thinking place of a metaphysician. Another way to think about this is to think about, okay, so were you able to put your own viewpoints on hold, your own ideas about free will, causality, and moral responsibility on hold while trying to understand what Lawhead was saying about the various organizing statements that he used to introduce you to the problem of free will and the theories? Remember, he had those statements. So then when he introduced you to the gist of those theories at the end of the introductory section for the problem of free will, how well did you reflect intellectual empathy then? So when you were learning about the basics of hard determinism, which he sometimes just calls determinism, which is confusing, what about when you had to switch over to understanding libertarianism? Were you able to put your own views on hold? Were you able to, remember that, yes, the determinist thinks this way, but now I'm going to learn about the libertarian. And then when you got to what he calls compatibilism, but I think it's better to call it soft determinism, were you able to express intellectual empathy to get into the thinking place of the soft determinist? Your ability to clearly, accurately, and precisely understand each of those theories, how they compare and how they contrast, is in part a function of that. But again, the idea here is not simply that you did that, but that you were really able to put your own viewpoints on hold, your own thoughts on hold, to really understand from within those theories and any thinkers associated with those theories what is to be thought of with respect to causality, free will, and moral responsibility. So you might have started reading thinking, what's the issue? Of course we have free will. Or you might have been thinking, of course we can hold people morally responsible for their actions. Or you might have been thinking, hey man, not everything's caused, some things just spontaneously happen. Were you able to put thoughts like that on hold to really try to understand the theories? Or did you let your own viewpoints about causality, free will, and moral responsibility, were you not able to put those on hold to the side to really try to understand what each theory was about, where it was coming from, its logic, and whatnot? All right, so then when it comes to this, remember, you need to construct this paragraph if you're doing it before the test, so that you can just copy and paste it, because the test is timed. So you don't really have time to go through this video and write your paragraph. I mean, you could try, but I don't recommend it. Remember that, as I stated in the last video for extra credit, you shouldn't use Google Docs, because I have found, and students have found, that when they copy and paste from Google Docs, even though they might see a font in context, when I open up the test or open up a submission in Blackboard, I don't see it, and then I can't count it. So Word, or typing your response in email and then copying and pasting it from that into the test, or that'd be the quickest thing. Or you could retype your answer, having already a typed up answer, but that takes time. Now let's get into the expectations. So your first sentence should tell me what your score is. So actually use a sentence to give me your score. So this is supposed to be a coherent paragraph where you use good writing skills. So you will say, when it comes to intellectual empathy, and use words from this question to phrase your first sentence. So when it comes to understanding how philosophers think, blah, 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 I would rate myself or give myself the score of, okay, and then a sentence. What does that number mean? Okay, what does it mean to you? Or what did I say it means? Or what does this mean? Or you can even tell me, I scored a 1, that's far away from rocking it. And then you could then tell me, what do you mean by far away from rocking it? When you do that, you want to have at least 3 more sentences where you incorporate words from the official definition. So phrases or words from the definition and or these dimensions here to explain and convince me and defend your rating, why maybe you think you didn't reflect it very much, why you had a challenge or you struggled to reflect intellectual empathy in this context. Or you're going to use, so if you do that, if you're giving yourself a low score, you want to talk about how you lacked or didn't reflect or didn't manifest something that I talk about in here. So again, highlight the words that you're pulling from the definition from this part of the lesson. Don't pull, you can pull from here actually. This would be really good. So in the last extra credit assignment for the previous test, I said not to pull from significance, but I'm looking at the significance here for intellectual empathy, and I think it would be very helpful to pull from here as well. Just remember to use quotation marks if you lift 3 or more consecutive words from the slide. Hopefully you've taken pictures of all the slides. If not, go ahead and do that so you can refer to them. You'll need the information throughout the semester and whatnot. So yeah, make sure that you embed words and phrases in a meaningful, compelling, relevant way from the definition and some of the bullet points into your explanation, defense, justification of your score. Again, if you have a low score, you're going to tell me that you lacked something explained here. If you give yourself a high score, you want to talk about that you reflected something, but you do have to be specific. You do have to refer to something specific in the reading, specific concepts, specific theories, relative to your psychological subjective experiences and your efforts, your will, your mindfulness, your disposition, mindfulness and awareness and reflection on your ability to imaginatively put yourself in the thinking place of metaphysicians, of those who focus on the problem of free will, of the hard determinist, the metaphysical libertarian, the soft determinist, in relation to understanding the problem of free will and how these concepts hang together and the implications for how we define those concepts and think about them.